Hello, dear aspirants. Welcome back to my YouTube channel IasCommando. And in this video, we are going to discuss the topic of loss and damage issue, which is in news currently because of the COP28 summit, which is taking place. So, because of the COP28 summit, which is taking place, this issue of loss and damage is in news very much, and we have to study this in detail, both from the prelims perspective and the mains perspective. So, 2 3 days ago, I was checking the copy of an aspirant, and I realized 2 3 things that students are not clear with what is the meaning of adaptation, what is the meaning of mitigation, and how is this loss and damage different from adaptation and mitigation. So you might, if you have studied environment, you might know that there is fund for adaptation, there is fund for mitigation. So why this loss and damage fund is separate? Okay, so let us understand what this topic is and what is the current affairs related to is, so that we can be prepared for both prelims and mains perspective. Now let's begin our topic. Okay, so now students see, in this year the COP28, the Conference of Parties, or 28 of United Nations Framework Convention of Climate Change is taking place in Dubai. Now in Dubai, what has been announced is loss and damage fund has been announced. And why this fund is being announced? To assist vulnerable countries which are facing the impact of climate change. Okay, so now you see, let us see the facts of the summit. Now this fund is of the magnitude of dollar 455 million, 475 million, sorry. This fund is of the magnitude of 475 million, which is very less, because at least you need 100 billion funds for these activities, but this is very less compared to, let's say, if you are taking the investment going to the startups, even in gaming industry. So this is very essential, but then also we see that funding is so short. UAE is contributing 100 million. European Union is contributing 275 million. US is contributing, see, just 17.5 million. They are giving more than this in game shows such as Squid Games. But then okay, and Japan is giving 10 million. So this is the initial contribution of the fund. And see, loss and damage came into news in COP, Conference of Party, two times. One was in COP 2013, which happened in Warsaw, Poland, and there a Warsaw International Mechanism was established, okay, which was related to loss and damage. And then here, last COP, which happened in Sharm el Sheikh Summit in Egypt, there also there was a lot of discussion on loss and damage, and finally this fund is established in a COP28 in Dubai. Okay, so what is this loss and damage fund? It is actually a global financial package which is aimed at rescuing and rehabilitating countries that are affected by cascading effects of climate change. Okay, so we'll see this in very much detail, that why loss and damage fund is required and what is the actual meaning of loss and damage. So these are just the facts related to what is being happening currently. Okay, now let's move forward. Okay, now see, this compensation has basically come from rich nations, and this is basically the compensation which the developed countries, or those countries which have contributed to global greenhouse gas emissions over a very long period of time, since the beginning of the industrial revolution in 1850s to now. Okay, so basically, this is being given by developed countries to developing countries, okay, which are facing the brunt of the climate change that is ongoing. So that is rising sea level, floods that are taking place, droughts and cyclones. So because of the recurring effect of these things, okay, because you might have heard, if you are reading climate change and everything from a long time. So you might have heard that these cyclones, their frequencies have increased. Okay, especially tropical cyclones frequency have increased. The floods, there are a lot of extreme weather rainfall events, and floods have increased. And then you might have heard that about flash droughts, that in a very relatively short period of time there is evaporation of moisture, extreme evaporation of moisture. So these are called flash droughts. So these kind of effects are increasing, and these impact of changing climates are influencing livelihoods, people lives, biodiversity, cultural tradition, their identities. So this is very on a personal level, and the poorer communities are affected here. Okay, the poorer communities life, livelihood, biodiversity, cultural tradition and identities are affected. Now, loss and damage can be categorized as economic and non economic. Okay, so for example, if there is any of these events such as rising sea levels, floods, and droughts and cyclones, then obviously there will be loss of infrastructure. So, we will need to rebuild infrastructure, or we have to compensate for agriculture damage. So, these type of losses which can be measured are called are called economic losses, in which we are basically including infrastructure losses or loss of agricultural revenue. And in non-economic losses, we are including trauma that happens to people because of natural disaster. So whenever there is cyclone, then people have to be evacuated, and then their homes are destroyed, their livelihoods are lost. So these called trauma also, because try to understand this thing. You built your home with so much effort in by putting the entire savings of your life, and that is destroyed within a period of 2 3 hours. So we are talking about that trauma. Okay, we are talking about that trauma. Loss of community, people lives are also lost, and biodiversity loss. So no one is going to evacuate biodiversity from that area. Humans, you will be readily evacuating, but you won't be evacuating biodiversity loss. But in the long run, this will have consequences on the life of the people as well. So for that also, so because these cannot be quantified in monetary terms, that is why these are called non-economic losses. All right. Now, see, we have to understand the context of loss and damage. So, we are understanding something known as historical responsibility and polluter pays principle. Okay, so these things we are understanding here. So, focus here. It is saying that industrial era since 1815 disrupted Earth's natural greenhouse gas emissions. Now, if you see, UK, US, and European Union are responsible for 50% of all emissions, all greenhouse gas emissions that are in atmosphere now. Okay, and if we add Russia, Canada, and Japan to this, then this goes up to 65%. India is responsible for just 4% of the emission, and we have 20% of the world population now. Okay, 16 to 20% between we have the world population now. Okay, and if you look at China, so for the past 15 years, China is responsible for emitting 30% of the global greenhouse gas emission. Okay, and per capita, our gas emission is very, very less. So, whatever damage is happening to vulnerable communities in India and other poorer nations, that is because of these countries emitting, but they are able to live a comfortable life by emitting these greenhouse gases, having the luxuries, but not paying for this. So, this is the issue of loss and damage. Okay, historical responsibility and what we call polluter pays principle. So we want these countries to compensate for the greenhouse gas emissions and their effect which are happening now. Okay, so this is a short introduction of this thing. Otherwise, this concept is very long. Okay, now let's move on. All right. So, if we talk about in terms of research, then 55 vulnerable countries suffered a loss of 525 billion dollar. Okay, 525 billion dollar in climate crisis fuel losses. And you see what is the amount of initial funding? Only 475 million, not even 1 billion. And how much is the loss? 525 times is the loss. So you see how inadequate this fund is, and it is estimated that it will reach $580 billion by 2030. Okay, that this will reach $580 billion by 2030. Now see this fund, loss and damage fund, which is established here in Dubai summit of COP28, this will be overseen by World Bank. Okay, now World Bank will oversee this fund. Now, see, funding sources of this fund are coming from not just the rich nation, US, UK, and EU. Some developing countries are also going to contribute here. Okay, so if in MCQs it comes that loss and damage fund is funded only by the developed countries, then this will be wrong. Okay, so these kind of questions can be made in the form of a statement, and it can be asked in UPSC. So definitely pay attention to these small things. Okay, now developing countries were initially hesitating to have World Bank oversight on loss and damage. Why? Because they fear that because World Bank is one of the Bretton Woods institutions which is dominated by the West, especially by the USA and UK, so they will have more control over finances. So that is why developing countries were initially hesitating to have World Bank oversight, but because it was necessary to reach an agreement on how to establish the loss and damage fund, so they gave up and they agreed for World Bank oversight. All right. Now let us understand the concept of um, why basically we are asking for loss and damage in a little bit of detail. Okay, so majority of our greenhouse gases are carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, these HFCs, hydrofluorocarbons. There is perfluorocarbon, perfluoroethane, and sulfur hexafluoride. Okay, now if you see from pre-industrial era, there see some of these have been zero in the atmosphere, but now they have some quantity. Okay, but if you see pre-industrial era, concentration of carbon dioxide was 280. Now in 2018 it was 411. If methane we see, so this was 0.715 ppm. Now it is 1.877. Okay. So now you see their concentration have increased, and their atmospheric lifetimes is also given. So carbon dioxide, once they are released into the atmosphere, carbon dioxide, because it can be fixed, so there is a variable lifetime of carbon dioxide. But methane, it takes 12 years for methane to disappear from the atmosphere. So by that 12 years, it will absorb more greenhouse gas. It will absorb more and more solar radiation to make the earth more warmer. Okay. For nitrous oxide, it remains 121 years. N2O remains 121 years. So for a century, it is going to make the earth warmer. And if you look at their potential, so this methane is able to warm earth 28 times more than carbon dioxide. Similarly, your nitrous oxide is able to warm earth 265 times more than carbon dioxide. And these HFCs, they are able to warm earth more than 12,000 times. And obviously you can see their uses also, which are given here, because direct question have been asked by UPSC in the year 2023 from what are the uses of HFCs. Okay, so they were foaming agents, they were refrigerants, they were used as electronics. Okay, so these uses were also asked. So this is the nature. Now you see all the developed countries are releasing these in atmosphere. Okay, so it is not like that they are disappearing from the atmosphere. So 100 years ago, if nitrous oxide was released in some of the industrial process in the atmosphere by a developed country, so it is making the earth warmer. And the impact of warmer earth is basically more on the vulnerable and poor countries. Okay, the countries who are living close to sea. Okay, so their ecosystems are disturbed, and even their cropping pattern is disturbed, their livestock cannot be saved, they are uh, they have to bear so many natural disasters because of the climate change. So because of that, we need loss and damage for these communities. Okay, so because of that, so I think now you completely understand with the help of fact why loss and damage is important. Okay, now let's move on. Now, see, I was checking aspirants copy, and in that I came to know that students uh, do not understand the basic meaning of adaptation, mitigation, and loss and damage. So I am trying to clear this thing here. Okay, now what is adaptation? Now see, future climate change will be there. In future, the will be changed, and we have to adapt to that thing. Okay, we have to adapt to that thing. For example, if certain varieties of crops cannot be grown in those high temperature in the tropical region, okay, so how will the community adapt to those changes? Okay, so this is about adaptation, is about adjusting to the current or expected future climate. Okay, adjusting to the current or expected future climate change. So that is about adaptation. Okay, so basically, in adaptation, we take measures to reduce the vulnerability of communities and ecosystem to which are impacting the climate change. Okay, and what is the objective of adaptation? It's to build resilience of the communities, that if any disaster comes, it is not that the community is completely uprooted economically, socially. Okay, so our goal is to build resilience in adaptation. Okay, so these are the keywords that you should remember when you are talking about adaptation. What? These are process of adjusting to the current or expected future climate change, and to objective is to build resilience and enhance the abilities of the ecosystems and societies to cope up with what? Temperature, precipitation patterns, and sea level and extreme weather events. Okay, and what is the example of adaptation? Okay, so you are building sea walls to protect against rising sea level. So this is one of the measure of adaptation. You are implementing water management strategies because your precipitation patterns are changing completely. So for that, you are implementing water management strategies, and you are developing drought resistance crop, because you know, because of climate change there is so much heat, there will be more drought, more flash drought. So you are developing those varieties of crops. So these are the measures that you are taking in adaptation. Okay, now let's move on to mitigation. Now what is mitigation? Mitigation involves action and strategies to reduce and prevent the emission of greenhouse gases. Okay, so you are trying to reduce the greenhouse gases emission in the atmosphere. That is known as mitigation. Okay, that is known as mitigation. And what is the main objective of mitigation? To stabilize or to reduce the concentration of greenhouse gases. Okay, the main objective of the mitigation is to stabilize or reduce the concentration of greenhouse gases. Okay, fine. Now let's see what are the examples of mitigation. So you are developing a renewable energy project. So that is the example of mitigation, because you won't be using that much of energy in producing electricity when you are that much of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere you won't be releasing if you are using renewable energy sources. Okay, you are improving energy efficiency, so that means already carbon dioxide emission is saved. You are uh, going for afforestation, so carbon dioxide will be absorbed from the atmosphere. This is one of the sequestering method also. Sequestering means removing the carbon from the atmosphere, and implementing sustainable land use practices. So these are all the examples of mitigation. Okay, these are all the example of mitigation. Now let's move on to what is loss and damage actually. So loss and damage refers to the residual impacts of climate change that cannot be avoided. Okay, so because climate change is taking place, because the developed countries have emitted so much of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, there is something which even adaptation and mitigation cannot handle. Okay, so that comes in loss and damage, because we cannot do anything but bear these consequences. Okay, so to bear these consequences we need some support, and that support is coming in the form of loss and damage fund. Okay, that support is coming in the form of loss and damage fund. So I hope you understand this now. Okay, so basically when you are failing to adapt or mitigate, then you have to compensate. So that compensation is loss and damage fund. Okay, uh, what is the objective in loss and damage? To reduce the impact of the climate change. Loss and damage recognize that some impacts are unavoidable and they cannot be avoided, they have to be compensated. Okay, so we will seek compensation for the damages incurred. Okay, and these has to be paid by those countries, developed countries such as US, UK, EU, and the developed countries Australia, Canada, and even Russia. Okay, but in the future countries must ask from China also, because now it is responsible for 30% of the greenhouse gas emission every year. Okay, and what are the example of the loss and damage? There is irreversible loss of biodiversity. So if there is extreme weather event and a species is lost, then obviously you cannot reverse the loss of biodiversity. Okay, and displacement of communities due to sea level rise. Okay, so once the sea level has already risen, the land has been submerged and the ecosystem has been destroyed, then there is nothing that can happen. You can only rehabilitate them by giving them some money. Okay, so that is the example of this. And economic losses from extreme weather events. Okay, so these are the examples. So I think now you must have understood what loss and damage, adaptation and mitigation entails. Okay, now let's move on. Now let's see very briefly what are the key differences between adaptation. Okay, so key differences is, what is the focus of adaptation? It focuses on adjusting to the current and expected future climate to reduce vulnerability. Mitigation focuses on the root causes of climate change by reducing greenhouse gas emission. Okay, and loss and damage focuses on unavoidable impact that result in negative consequences. Okay, so this is about managing current and expected climate change. This is about stabilizing greenhouse gas emissions or reducing greenhouse gas emission, and this is about addressing the unavoidable impacts that result in negative consequences. Okay, now let's move forward a bit. Now what about timing? Okay, so ongoing and continuous process to deal with current and future climate impacts. Okay, mitigation, this is an ongoing effort to reduce emissions for long term stabilization. This is for current and future, but this is for long term stabilization, and this is after the impacts of climate change. Okay, aftermath of some extreme weather events or any event due to climate change which cause damage. So this addresses these things when something has happened, and then after you have to compensate, you have to rehabilitate. So those kind of things. Okay, now let's move on. And you see, adaptation and mitigation are both preventive measures. So, adaptation is preventive for what? To minimize future impacts. And mitigation is preventive measure for what? To reduce the drivers of the climate change. Okay, because these are the greenhouse gases which are the drivers of climate change. So, mitigation is doing just that. It is trying to reduce the drivers of the climate change. And then you have loss and damage. Okay, then you have loss and damage, and loss and damage is basically not the preventive but the responsive measure to cope up and recover with unavoidable impacts. Okay, so I think now this will be clear to all of you. Adaptation is preventive measures to minimize future impact. Mitigation is preventive measure to reduce the drivers of climate change, and loss and damage is responsive measure to cope up with and recover from unavoidable impacts. Okay, okay, fine. Now, what is the scope of adaptation? So, those strategies and actions which enhance resilience, they come under adaptation. Those actions that reduce emissions, they come under mitigation. And those actions that address the consequences of unavoidable impact, and their basically focus is on providing support and compensation, that comes under loss and damage. Okay, that comes under loss and damage. Fine. So this was up for this class. I think all of you must have understood this topic which came in current affairs, and I try to elaborate it a bit so that you understand what is the concept. So thank you so much for this class. We'll meet in the next class.